Now, recognizing that when I'm one of the latter speakers in today's conference, I wanted to make sure that I kept my presentation's content to a minimum and our conversation to an absolute maximum. So right out the gate, start thinking about all of those vexing problems in social media world that you've been having with your various communities and how you'd like to sort of start to engage those communities potentially at the next level. Just by way of a little bit of introduction, some of my slides might be a little out of order today because we just converted them to PowerPoint. I'm usually a Mac guy, but so if anything looks a little funny, that's why. MediaStyle is an interdisciplinary firm, so we're not like your traditional advertising agency. We're not a traditional GR firm. We're not a media relations firm. Instead, what we do is solve communications problems, and we solve them at what we call the nexus of creativity, research, and community in action. Some of the things that we've been able to do the best in my office with the team that we have is engage everyday Canadians into acting out on behalf of an organization or an idea, and that's part of what I want to talk to you about today. But first, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And we're going to go way back for that. Sorry. There we go. Okay. One step further back. This is the Gutenberg Press. This is, in essence, basically where all communication starts. So when we talk about buy-in with our communities, we've got to talk about a few different types of buy-in. One is executive buy-in. The very folks who have sent you likely to this conference are probably the same people who approve your social media budgets or your lack thereof social media budgets. And most certainly that a lot of the buy-in that we have to do has to start at that particular level. So you might wonder why I've gone all the way back to the printing press. In fact, the very introduction of what we would as communicators consider sort of the birth of democracy in communications, when these little tiny letters could be moved around on a page, and then the page could be turned into leaflets and pamphlets and political information, and of course, most importantly, a Bible that people could read for the first time ever. Now, cheapers, Ian, why have you gone to the Bible? This is an advanced social media strategies course. Well, it's important for us to be able to explain as communicators to all of the various people who make our very funding decisions that what we're doing today with zeros and ones and pushing pixels around is very much similar to when they were pushing little letters around on the Gutenberg Press. And we'll explain that over the course of my presentation. So from the Gutenberg Press, of course, comes the printed word, the granddaddy of all media, newspapers. I see them still lying around the table. Funny, not everybody has iPads. There's still some Globe and Mails around, I see. So the newspaper still continues to reign over us. In the world of communications, of course, newspapers were highly partisan at first. They were extremely biased. They didn't have much ethics. Sort of sounds like the early days of blogging, doesn't it? We'll start to see these patterns, by the way, as technology introduces itself over and over and over again. Each time technology introduces itself into the way Canadians and the world interact with one another, it in fact has effects on how we interact with each other. So radio comes along. Now, radio is a much more immersive medium. This is probably the first time you'll notice that I'm a McLuhanite, a hardcore follower of Marshall McLuhan's theories. So radio, in his mind, was a more immersive medium than newsprint. You, instead of having to actively engage your brain all of the time, instead that medium could then wash over you. Now, how true that is, we don't know entirely, but what we do know is that once the radio came along, newspapers got a lot stronger. More newspapers started coming. The craving for news and information started to grow. And again, this is another one of these patterns through technological evolution that we continue to see over and over and over again. So as the radio comes along, newspapers become stronger. They become more objective. They become more organized. And then, of course, as they get into the more modern era, they become more conglomerated, but we won't go there just yet. Then, of course, the television. Who remembers this? This is what we used to do. We used to stick your kid in front of the TV because that was a very expensive purchase. It was probably the third most expensive thing in your entire house. You probably purchased your house, and maybe you didn't in the 40s or the 50s. Instead, you had maybe your car and your icebox, and then your TV. And that was a huge purchase to make. So could you imagine, all across Canada, you've got major decisions being made as to how much money they were going to set aside each and every month to be able to scrimp and save and to get this particular piece of technology. And of course, once they got it into the house, they stuck their kid beside it, and then they took a photo. And we giggle and we think it's funny now, but just go to Flickr and type in Apple unboxing and see how many people take photos of exactly how their Apple product comes out of the box. Folks, it hasn't changed. It's the exact same thing. We can use this when we explain our way of communicating with the very people, like I said, who we need buy-in from first, which is our bosses, our managers, our clients, the people who give us money. After TV, of course, comes along these little things that we throw up into the sky called satellites. Oh, those made a real huge difference. And then mid-1990s, the Gulf War, #1, of course, the Pentagon calls CNN and says, do not turn off the live feed. We rely on it. So again, we see communications evolving in such a rapid way to where we are today. Online, digital communications, and fundamentally something changed in between the introduction of the satellite, which is also fundamental as to why we even have the internet, and then, of course, the internet itself. The internet itself has gone through multiple different iterations of how adaptive and reactive it is, and the place that we're at now is, in fact, where our conference is at, is that we like to call this social media. Now, I like to say that this is actually social media. Conferences and these types of things have been happening forever. So again, when you go back to your folks who make the decisions for you, please remind them that social media is not new. They were doing it in the 1980s. It was called direct mail. Okay, I swear, right? It was called going to a conference and talking to people. Social, shared mediums, right? It was chain letters. It was asking people to pass along the newsletter to other colleagues. That's how shared media was done. It was a much smaller portion of what we would traditionally see as a quadrant of earned media, media relations, that take care of that stuff, owned media, the stuff we literally physically own, potentially your website, your mailing lists, your house organs, these types of things, paid media. Most people don't engage in paid media because it costs a lot of money. And then shared media, which is that fourth portion of the quadrant that we'll talk about mostly today. But first, something really important. Because you won't be able to get buy-in from your communities if you don't have some fundamental understanding of the difference between strategy and objectives and tactics and goals. Okay, so this is the first and the only way that I can ever remember this, and I have to continually tell my team this over and over and over again, that strategy is to objectives as tactics are to goals. Okay, so to that end, let's talk in the really broad. So I have an objective to communicate to a large audience of Canadians about an idea or a thought or a product. My strategy is what's going to support that. So how are you going to achieve that particular objective? Broadly, the umbrella. Then, underneath that, you list all of the various goals that you're going to need to do to actually be able to accomplish that particular objective of communicating to a large group of people about your idea or your organization. And then the tactics assigned to each and every one of those goals. So one of my goals is to get on Facebook and to have 100 new friends. Well, that's great. What are your tactics to doing that? Tactic 1, sign up. Swear to God, write it down. Tactic 2, start friending people. Anyway, we'll go through that. But strategy is to objectives as tactics are to goals. I think most of you know that from the advanced course, but it's good to remind you right away so that as we move forward with planning how we're going to talk to communities, we don't start mixing up strategies, objectives, tactics, and goals. These are not interchangeable words, and they never have been, right? But really important in all of this is once we start to engage any given community, we need to understand what motivates that community. Now, if we sort of track back ever so briefly to all the way back to Gutenberg, what motivated the community of newly created readers? Knowledge, right? If you move forward to newspapers, radio, all of these types of things, you note that a core motivation becomes knowledge. But we need to break that down a little bit further. How do we do that? First and foremost, just ask some questions of your folks, of your various communities, of your colleagues, of your friends, of your neighbors. So the first and foremost thing that you need to do to start any research in how you're going to build an online community is informally talk to people. Doesn't cost anything. Send out an email to your colleagues at work saying, hey, how do you use Facebook? How do you use Twitter? Start talking to the very people who will be the base level of your community and see how they use the technology. That's step 1. Doesn't cost anything. Step 2, formal interview process. Write down an interview, create a survey. This is done in-house. So you start to figure out exactly what technologies, say for instance you're in a membership-driven organization, this is the point where you would probably pick up the telephone and start to phone executives across the country and say, hey, in your membership, are there a lot of people who use Facebook? Are there a lot of Twitter users? Do you know that? Do you have any clue? And you start to interview high-level sources, right? So across everybody's organization and in all of their worlds, you've got people that are your touchstones, and that's when you go to them and you set up a formal interview. Right after that, then you've got surveys. And these are a little bit more broad-based.